Welcome to Tech Conversations with Grace Chng. Tech Conversations is a podcast by News on Tech where we empower business leaders with critical insights on emerging trends to equip them with the actionable intelligence to stay ahead. Today we are diving into a game-changing topic, how AI is transforming finance organizations, strengthening cybersecurity, and preparing for quantum-safe security. Joining us is Matthew Hardman, Chief Technology Officer for Asia-Pacific of Hitachi Vantara. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, Matthew, and how long have you been in Asia?
So I moved over here to Singapore probably around about 26 years ago. I used to live in Australia. Mm-hmm. I was working at that time for Microsoft and then joined Microsoft up here in Asia-Pacific. Where I had the pleasure of working across lots of different roles, and I had the opportunity to launch Windows as a product.
That's a long time ago.
That's where we first met. We're talking
Yes.
about Windows 7, I remember, and Windows Phone. There's probably a lot of people who don't know about that phone anymore. Mm-hmm. But since then, I've worked for companies like VMware, LinkedIn, and Hitachi. So I've had this incredible opportunity to be able to really see technology through the eyes of many different people across Asia and learn lots of different things. And when you travel, you do recognize that you can't necessarily say Asia anymore. Like it is a culmination of different markets with different challenges and different cultures, and all of that plays into technology. So it's an incredible role.
So AI has automated many back-end operations in finance, streamlining workflows, automating processes. But what has GenAI brought to the game? Is it predictive analysis? It is modeling? What?
So I think the first place to start, especially when I talk to a lot of people, is that AI is not necessarily just GenAI. That's where most people get engaged, right? They have that opportunity where they can open up a browser, go to a website and start asking questions. And we probably start with funny questions first, but then eventually we start to get a little bit more engaged and ask questions which we're trying to find real answers for. But AI itself, obviously, as you start to break into its various areas, it can be quite comprehensive. You know, you talked about automation. I mean, that is the foundational aspect of AI, but we start getting into machine learning. We start getting into advanced data analytics. All of those provide different levels of AI. Now, the way we see customers utilizing that technology is really starting to get into areas of how do I do product development? How do I do offer development? How do I do recommendations? How do I start to think about sentiment? And so being able to utilize that technology to provide a whole range of different functions which provide business value starts to become the realization of the vision that people have for AI. And I think that's where it starts to get exciting when you move beyond the Gen AI part into what's actually being built and outcomes from AI.
So the Gen AI is like the teaser that brings you into the real AI workflow.
I think I like to look at it from a way that helps to translate the interaction from a human to the computer, right? So, you know, Gen AI is really about building up on models and taking lots of information and data and transforming it into something which can be interpreted and understood. And so when you start moving from the training into the implementation, it takes what you're saying, understands the context of what you're saying, and then starts to formulate a response as it starts to move forward and gives you information in a way you understand it. So that becomes then, I guess, the doorway or the way to intersect with the next generation of AI models and the next generation of AI applications and a whole range of different experiences.
So AI needs a lot of data
Yes.
for you to get going, right? But data breaches are catastrophic for businesses. So how does AI enhance data security and encryption?
There's a big emphasis right now on how people can utilize AI to improve their security posture, especially when it comes down to data. It used to be a case that people would say it's all about prevention, right? Now people are starting to recognize that I can't just game on prevention only. I've got to think about what's going to happen with recovery, what's going to happen with resiliency and things like that. So the way they start to utilize AI in those situations is to be able to detect what's actually going on. It's no longer a walled garden. I mean, our work lives and our home lives have blended, and so it means devices and a whole range of different experiences that people are utilizing. So the barriers of the past don't necessarily exist, and AI is going to be one of those systems that's going to help us to be able to detect abnormalities in what's going on, or anomalies, I should say.
Now, how is AI being used to combat fraud and enhance compliance? I think, which is the emphasis? Is it to combat fraud or enhance compliance?
Wow. I think those are actually almost two, they intersect, no doubt at all, right? But they also can be two separate things, right? When we think about compliance, I mean, there's lots of different regulations that governments are actually asking people to do to adhere to compliance. So let's pick on that one a little bit for first. One of the challenges I think many organizations will face, especially with AI, is potentially shadow data gathering processes, right? And I don't know if that's good. There's probably a better term than that, but we've seen this before, and you've seen this before. When the cloud came out, IT was probably a little bit apprehensive about it in the first place because they didn't necessarily want to take their IT operations out of the data center. But business units and people who were looking for outcomes for businesses rapidly went to the cloud because it was a source of innovation. And they would take their corporate credit card and they would go and start utilizing it, right? We had this concept of shadow IT. What we're going to get now is shadow AI. And the concern is that organizations or business units in the pursuit of competitive advantage will start to be shadow AI consumers, and they will start to collect their own sets of data and they will start to feed it into these AI systems, which may not necessarily be under the purview of the IT department. So you're going to have situations here where governance becomes a big issue.
You're going to have silos too.
Absolutely. And this is the challenge that organizations have. It's where is the data? And I think beyond that, it's not so much where is the data, is it the right data, right? We're going to have multitudes of copies after copies after copies of data. And let's be honest, no one's actively saying, should we update all those copies of data? Like whoever has the latest version, that is the right piece of data, but then they might take a copy and it sits there. I mean, how many times have you looked for an Excel spreadsheet and realize it's out of date? Yeah. That's what an organization is going to face. And if the data is out of date and the AI is trained on that data, then the performance of your AI models will be at risk. It may represent your organization in the wrong sort of way. And then there's a whole nother conversation about retrieval augmented generation, how that benefits. But it's challenging from that point of view. The second area you talked about was fraud, right? And how do you jump into that? Now, of course, that's where you'll start to see AI really shine, is the ability to be able to train models to look for patterns that you can train a human to do, but they're not necessarily going to be able to think about all those different scenarios off the top of their head. They're not going to be able to react so quickly. So an AI model that's been trained on looking for fraudulent patterns and is able to look across those different patterns and look for commonalities or look for something that might interact a problem will be a much better situation. So AI will benefit all those different areas. It's just really how are you train the purpose-built models to be able to apply to a problem you're trying to go ahead and actually solve.
Just to go back to the bit on compliance, when you have IT shadow data, people collecting information, how do you ensure that there is no data silos?
Yeah, there's part of it's going to be education, and a lot of this stuff quite often is really going back and educating people. I mean, this is not anything unusual. I think when we actually had the situation of people being in a mobile workforce, they were encouraged not to keep their data on the machines, right? That data governance aspect, that training has not changed, right? It's still important. But you are going to need to start thinking about implementing a much greater sense of governance in terms of those systems. Do you allow people to export data? Do you allow them to take it out? We sort of head towards a rapid implementation of ease of functionality. And on the surface, that might be great. Like if I can export data from a web page into an Excel spreadsheet and I can do manipulations on that Excel spreadsheet in real time, that's great from a functionality point of view, but is it the best thing for the data? So the question that an organization needs to ask is, what is more critical to me? Is it the ease of use or is it the protection of the data?
Right. Okay. How does agentic AI play into fraud prevention?
I think this is where we're going to see some really interesting scenarios actually play out, because AI by itself might be able to give you an indication of something's happening. But let's say, for example, at 3 a.m. in the morning, that actually starts to happen. You're probably not waiting for that alert to come through, right? You want that system to be able to take some sort of action. And while automation plays a part of that, agentic AI will be able to take active decisions on what is the right path to go ahead and actually take. And of course, we are looking at a higher level form of AI at that point. But that agentic AI will be able to say, okay, my role is to make sure I'm playing a protective shepherding of what's going on in your data, what's going on in your networks. And if I detect this sort of thing to actually happen, then I'm going to go make a determination on what the next step actually is going to be, and I'm going to take this action and so forth. And really, that's kind of what we want to get to. I think as we start to look at agentic AI, it's almost becoming closer to what we see in terms of Jarvis and Iron Man and things like that. But that's where those decisions will come in. So agentic AI, it's complicated and it requires a lot of work to get there, but that will help us get to a better place.
There's a lot of engineering and programming going on with agentic AI.
Yeah, there's a lot of work. I mean, there's a lot of organizations who are building out these agentic AI models, and they're still in that sort of phase of getting acceptance.
So in the consumer space, I can tell a platform, I want to go for a holiday in Finland. Please book the air tickets and the hotels and arrange for the tours. So is it as simple as that in the enterprise space?
No, because you're looking at a whole range of different things around. I mean, if I take your example and say, hey, I want to go to Finland and book for me a hotel, I'm not necessarily saying, and at the same time, please ensure that you are adhering to government regulations around this particular data. You know, if I was in India, DPDPA is the data privacy regulation that people need to look for. That's a fairly complicated legal requirement that you need to be able to understand. And then, you know, if it came across cross-border data regulations, if you went from India to Europe and it was GDPR, how does that actually come in? So you don't need a lawyer to understand how to book a travel, but if we start to think about agentic AI, those aspects will become important.
So it takes some time to build this.
Oh yeah, and this is where I think industry specialists will play an absolute massive key to what's actually going on. You can build the technology, you can bring in the engineers, but it's going to be the interpretation of the approach. You know, and this is one of the things that people talk about with AI is how do you have non-biased AI? Well, you try to actually bring as much non-biased data as possible. But even the people who build the AI will have some form of bias. But we do need some of those industry expertise to help them build out.
So does agentic AI play in preventing ransomware? Can they be used?
I think there'll be aspects of it that they can actually be utilized. I mean, to go ahead and actually take action. But even fundamentals in AI today can actually help you to give you a better stance or a better situation from a security standpoint, because that AI can look for those models. You know, like I say, if we start seeing that there suddenly starts to be an influx of data which is being unnecessarily encrypted inside the organization, that's a pretty good situation. You might have ransomware going on inside your organization. And again, I want to segregate that machine out and separate it from the actual network.
It can tell you, or it can show patterns of a ransomware attack, but can it stop a ransomware attack? Can AI stop?
AI can potentially stop, especially if you look at it as a part of an automation to say, stop the attack. I mean, stopping the attack basically means you might segregate that out. So you probably can't go ahead and destroy the ransomware. The ransomware comes from a source from somewhere, right? You might be able to automate the process to disinfect your network with the ransomware, but are you going to be able to completely stop it? That could be a challenge, right? You've got to be thinking all the time about what is my recovery strategy as well as my prevention strategy, and hence why people are so much more interested in cyber resiliency these days rather than just backup and protection.
Okay. Coming to another form of security, and this quantum safe security. So last week I was moderating a couple of panels on quantum developments, and one was quantum security and quantum safe networks. I'm just wondering how business leaders are going to cope with everything that's on their plate today. They've got to be cyber aware. They've got to be aware of data risks, data breaches. Then they have AI. How do I deploy AI? How do I deploy Gen AI? And now there's quantum safe, And we know that many companies will only work if there's a compliance fact. But you still need to get ready. So what is your engagement with customers? What are they telling you?
Many customers we sort of talk to are asking for guidance, right? I mean, to your point, it is super complicated, right? I mean, to say the least, when you start to look at what's going on in the industry, like I quite often draw it on a whiteboard and say to people, if I were to sort of put all the complications you deal with, all the different regulations, do you know all the different regulations? And quite often they don't. And you sort of educate them on that. Then it's, how do you think about cyber resiliency? And it's like, okay, well, there's different interpretations. And then how do you think about AI and innovation? When things are good, people tend to angle their investments and focus towards innovation. When things go bad, they suddenly start to focus things back onto cyber resiliency. And a good example of that was when we had the IT sort of meltdown of last year. They had a real challenge and it actually brought down a lot of systems. And all of a sudden you saw a lot of organizations really pivot themselves over to what are we doing around cyber resiliencies. Right. Cyber resiliency, I should say. First. The other thing I would sort of say as well, and this is sort of a little bit challenging for some people, when I've gone to some of the AI conferences, and as you sort of say, you see this next generation technology. Quite often people are talking about, well, how to make it faster, how to make it better, how do I make it all these different things. We're at that stage now with AI when we're still in POC, but we are quickly getting to production, right? And one of the things I've sort of said to customers that perhaps you need to make sure you put aside 10, 15% of your budget to technical debt, and what are you doing for implementation? Like that AI project that worked inside your POC looks fantastic, but when you put it into production, have you thought about data protection? Have you thought about security? Have you thought about all these different things? And quite often they haven't. So I look at it and sort of say, look, as a customer, identify good foundations and frameworks you can follow. I think NIST has a great framework for security and cyber resiliency. And I think you've got to play a much more you've got to put money aside to think about that technical integration. If you don't, you're just going to run into a whole lot of different problems.
Yeah, so the best thing to do perhaps is maybe to start a small team of quantum talent, and get them to look at what the company needs.
Yeah, I mean, and there will be the quick wins that people will look for, right? But even before you get there, I would sort of say, well, maybe you start off with, okay, I want to experiment, but very quickly start to look for what are the business objectives you think you can go ahead and actually solve for that. And if you're really clear on that, then you have a better direction in terms of where that project's going to go. But then if you really are going to go ahead and actually utilize that into production, make sure you have mitigated risk by ensuring you've got good data practices, good implementations of security, you've got budget set aside to be able to go ahead and actually do that.
Yeah. So when we talk about AI in finance organizations, we often talking about FSI, the financial services industry, but for large companies with large finance organizations, what are the trends that you're seeing? How is AI being used in those kinds of divisions, company divisions?
A lot of it comes down to, there's some very practical things that people are doing in terms of sentiment analysis. That sort of analysis is what people are really interested in going ahead and actually utilizing. I think the other area you sort of see is the practical application of machine learning. Like we've talked about machine learning for a long time, but people are starting to actually really apply machine learning into the processes of what they actually do. One of the more interesting ones I get excited about is sort of more vision AI. And you look at high-speed manufacturing. Consumerism drives a lot of our manufacturing processes, and people want to consume a lot. And you can't actually have people standing by the side of the manufacturing line looking for faults in what's going on. But vision AI can give you that opportunity to do that at high speed. So, yeah, I think a lot of people are really moving beyond Gen AI into real practical examples that are starting to provide real business value now.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Matthew, for that interesting conversation, eye-opening. AI is not just revolutionizing finance, it's just making organizations more secure and safe. Well, thanks again, and thank you to our listeners for listening to us. Please go to your regular channels, Spotify and Apple Podcasts, to listen to us. Thank you.